Hello, everyone. My name is Amélie Gagnon. I'm leading the development unit at the International Institute for Educational Planning at UNESCO. Welcome to this webinar. It's a pleasure to have you on board for the second webinar that we're organizing to discuss the issues of equity, privatization, and the right to education. Many of you connected last week, and so it's a pleasure to have you again. And for the newcomers, thanks for joining. We're very happy to have you, and everything that you will see today in the next webinars, as well as the contents from the previous webinar, will be available on the dedicated webpage. So I wanted to take just a few moments to introduce the series, introduce this webinar. This series was designed and building upon previous work led at IIP over the last decades, looking at different issues related to equity, of course, but also how privatization can play a role in provision of education, and of course the broader frameworks of the right to education. So this last week, we discussed a broad introduction to the privatization of education, the different forms and diffusion. Today, we're going to compare approaches, the lessons from different education systems. And then we have two more sessions in the future, in March, to see how we can deliver education as a human right. And then a final discussion with other guests to discuss the broader implications for equity, privatization, and the right to education in different contexts. And so we will try to draw key conclusions and potential policy impacts for planners that plan and also manage education systems around the world. So it's a pleasure to welcome again Frank Adamson with us. He's providing us lots of food for thought. As of last week, you already introduced us to different concept definitions, and now today you're going to move and to continue sharing with us different key case studies, let's say, or insights from different parts of the world. You're a professor at Sacramento State University in the US. And today we'll be joined by a guest that you will introduce in more detail. But Dr. Anthony Verger is with us. Anthony, you work at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. It's a real pleasure to have you. You have different expertise, but one that is particularly interesting is that interplay that you study between governance and education policies, and especially the context of public-private partnerships. So we're very grateful to have you on board, and it's a pleasure to have you connecting from Spain, Barcelona. Just before we start, I will take a minute to reiterate the fact that we have interpretation available. So we have 4 languages today: English for the main floor, and then interpretation to French, Spanish, and Portuguese. We're piloting today to record all the 4 languages to make them available on the website for you in your favorite language. So we'll try. We'll see what it comes up with. But all the recordings, the slides, or the documents that we will mention will be put on the website as documentation. And we invite you to continue the discussion on Twitter. So I put a few hashtags that we use for this webinar series, so you can also continue and share your reflections on Twitter as we go. We will try to reserve enough time at the end of the webinar so that we can have a Q&A session with our 2 speakers. Please use the Q&A box to put the questions, and use the chat for something else, for introducing yourselves or sharing thoughts. But for questions, please use the Q&A box. And then this will make the process run very smoothly. So without further ado, I will just leave the floor to you, Frank, so that you can tell us, where we were last week, where we're going this week, and segue into the session with Tony. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amélie, and thank you to IIEP for organizing. Let's see if I can operate technology here. Share my screen. All right. And I am also putting my Twitter handle in case people want to tweet. I will be on that handle. So today we are jumping into round 2 of the webinar series, and I want to welcome everybody who is here last time, and welcome, as Amelie said, our newcomers. Very happy to have you. Last time, I'll do a little brief recap just to orient people. And then today I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Tony Verger from Barcelona. And he has some very interesting insights to share with us. So I will continue forward. And just to mention that, last time we talked about the definitions and the spread of privatization. Today, we're going to talk about lessons from different education systems and globally. And then we're going to talk about education as a human right next time. And then we'll finish off as Amelie talked with a final discussion about broader implications. So the webinar 1 recap, we laid out this definition, and there are 3 key components from the definition of privatization of funding, management, and ownership. So we're building on a lot of different previous definitions and foci that different researchers and institutions have proposed. And then we tracked it, and we tracked it by the pathways. How does this happen? There's a historic legacy, there can be catastrophe, ideology, and we talked about the mechanisms. And I would just want to highlight the mechanisms because that's some of what we'll focus on today, and especially Tony's talk. But there's low-fee private schools, charter schools, vouchers, and those play out in different countries and different policy contexts in different ways. And that will also be a topic, a thread of conversation today. And then finally, we presented this heat map where we're using, small slices of funding and management to just get an idea of where this is happening. And really, to point out the asymmetry of how it is deployed or taken up in different places. And this is the global map, and then we also discussed it as differential in individual context and countries. So we also got some responses from you all, and I just wanted to share the feedback as we put together our puzzle of privatization. That folks wanted to see evidence from countries. Wanted key takeaways about impacts. And then has this changed? What are the policy reversals that have happened? And that interplay of politics and education policy. And then finally, there was this question of, is this policy borrowing or colonialism? And I think that's a question that's important because it's underwriting the relationships between the global North and global South. And we'll point out how and where evidence gets used and where we have evidence, because there is a power asymmetry there. So today, what we're going to talk about is, there's 3 kind of key questions that I'm looking at when I'm thinking about privatization. What is the relationship to quality and achievement? And we see that, Tony will also kind of present this, that the results are very mixed at best. But that when we ask the second question about equity, and especially in the context of SDG 4, there are serious concerns about segregation, exclusion, stratification. And then what are the other alternatives? And so I will present that, some countries are doing a public investment model, and we'll discuss this later. And then Tony is going to talk about subtypes of privatization, and then really zoom out to a global perspective on some very interesting work looking at both these key topics of achievement and equity. And just to say that I almost actually built little road signs for this, like achievement road sign, equity road sign, alternatives road sign. So I didn't put them in there, but I want you to think about that. And I'm going to flag the road signs as we go through, because it's a lot of material. And I want you to be able to track the main themes that we're talking about. So on the country level, we published this book in 2016 that does a comparison of different privatization and public investment models using 3 pairs of countries. And we go through and we show that there's mostly higher achievement in the public investment models and equity as well. And we examine the policy context. So that's part of what I'm going to discuss today. And so the three country pairs are, Canada and the U.S. in North America, Chile and Cuba in Latin America, and Finland and Sweden in Europe. And you can see which one is Canada and Cuba and Finland are the public investment models. Privatization, Chile, United States, and Sweden. And one of the immediate questions about this book, what about us? Where are the examples from Africa? Where are the examples from Asia? As the author of the volume, I can tell you I would love to include them. I would love to have all the evidence, and I would love to, but the book was already long and there are publishing deadlines. But I do just want to address this right now because we have exciting new work coming up. We have a volume that's in press right now. Tony actually has a chapter in there with colleagues, and in particular, we do in this book, which is a compilation. It's dealing with the average job principles, but it looks at the legal side and the education side. And Linda Odornoa has written on the education side about key findings in low-fee private schools in the East African context. And she's examined this issue of quality. And we see these in the issue of quality, the issue of outcomes with mixed results, and widening stratification and inequality. And just before I delve into the points, I just want to mention that one of the big themes here is that we really do see a lot of the same issues happening as this is deployed right around the world. And so that's something I want you to understand as we move through these examples. And in particular, in the low-fee private school context, there's a high mobility and teacher attrition. The competition for teachers means there's increased moonlighting, and then often parents are unable to pay, and that means that there's insufficient income for the school. And then, one of the key points is the widening stratification. And it really creates what Linda brings out, this economic micro-segregation. That's really important because you have, people that are segregated by their means, and that's really not what we want to see in terms of a public education system that guarantees the right to education. So that's a quick taste, a teaser, if you will, for more work on Africa, and but I want to continue on to this other work where we'll continue to draw out these themes. And so last time I presented on these different, this triangle, this policy drivers, economic rationales, and education mechanisms. Well, today we look at public investment. We see a very different policy driver of public responsibility and democratic decisions, although not all the time, as we'll see. The economic rationales are more about access and preparation of citizens, and everybody who always claims that equity is at the center of what they're doing. And the mechanisms are really, if probably well-prepared teachers should be in 100-point font on this, because it is so important to have well-prepared teachers. That's the linchpin of successful education systems. And then, of course, on the privatization side, as we discussed last time, we have deregulation, liberalization. We have these key economic rationales of efficiency, choice, and competition that are really underpinned by a resource scarcity model. And the mechanisms that we'll talk about, vouchers, charters, low-fee private schools, all of these are mechanisms in which privatization happens. So briefly, I talked about Chile last time, and we ran through that the neoliberal model started in 1980 with vouchers as the mechanism. And there were fundamental changes to the system. And really, I showed last time the slide that talked about the the essentially apartheid system that developed in terms of access by social class to different types of schools. And this is an ideological reform that is founded on the Milton Friedman's concept of school choice, and then the mechanism of delivery was vouchers. So we're switching gears, looking at a more of a public investment model. And when I said democracy is not all the time, this is what I meant. Cuba is a command economy, but they have a strong public responsibility driver for universal access, and they invest in their teachers. And what the author of the Cuba chapter, Martin Carnoy, my advisor at Stanford, he found that there's this state-driven social capital that really is the linchpin of the system. So they have an equal social class across more than other countries. And they, that manifests in wage equality. And then their teachers are closely supervised and centrally trained, and they really do invest in their teachers heavily. But the teachers are also, compensated in a way that they're not constantly seeking out other employment to earn better wages. So it's within the education system of preparation, but also within the larger economic picture. And what does this mean for achievement? So this is one of the questions. So in Latin America, and these are older figures, but Cuba doesn't participate in many international assessments. So we see that in Latin America, you have an average here. And then in Chile, they're doing a little bit better in these assessments. And then Cuba is in a totally different realm. It's off the charts. And so we can see that really there is a result from this investment that Cuba is making in education. And actually, I'm going to pause it there. And we have a little bit of a poll to do. Last time we did a poll where we're talking about funding and the different components of privatization. But today we want to find out more about your context. So I'm going to go ahead and let Amelie conduct the poll.
So we have Camila here at IIP who is going to launch the poll. There you are. So the question is, how prevalent are different forms of education privatization in your context? And by forms, Frank, you mean different setups, right? The low fees, charter, vouchers, other formats. And so there you can select one answer, which would be if these forms are either very prevalent, somewhat prevalent, you're seeing beginning signs, or not present as far as you're concerned. So yeah, let's take time to submit some votes. And Camila, you will tell us when you see that the voting stations are empty.
The voting is starting to slow down a little. I'll give another 10 seconds and then I'll close the polling.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's an interesting spread. Yeah. So there's, we can see through who's on the webinar, not necessarily globally representative, but there are this idea, this phenomenon spreading, but not, completely taken up in terms of prevalence, but and still not present. So I think people are in very different places with this phenomenon, and that's very interesting. And so, go ahead.
No, I was showing. I was just thinking that it's interesting because unless we are an audience of people that are really looking at the numbers, this kind of is also kind of a perception of the supply of education in our countries. So it's a really interesting patterns that we're seeing.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. So when I continue on, so that was sort of the Latin American take on the achievement side and what the policy context and sort of broad strokes. So we turn to another example, the country pairs of Sweden and Finland. And in Sweden, they had a very, a public school model is fundamental to democratic society in the 50s. And then by the 1990s, they switched very quickly into private independent schools and using the ideas of decentralization and deregulation and competition as the rationale and the markets as the mechanism. And I just wanted to track this kind of national sentiment, right? In 1948, the prime task for the school is to form democratic humans. 1970, education is a spearhead in the future and the key to abolish class society. It's a very noble pursuit. 2006, we have this vision of to run a school and to sell refrigerators are one and the same. It's about having your ear to the market and understanding where the needs are for our customers. So that's just a very different take on how and why you operate the education system. And we can see that shift playing out. And we turn to Finland, which has different approaches. In 1970, they enacted many different educational investments, equalizing opportunity, eliminating tracking, having a common curriculum, and changing teacher education to a master's degree program. And they did this with a vision of equity as the driver, and then preparing citizens as the rationale. And really, as I said before, the well-prepared teachers are the mechanism. In their system, they had an economic crisis. They were on the cusp of following the Swedish model, and then the PISA scores came out in 2000. And many in Finland say that they were saved by the PISA in a way because their scores were so high that they weren't obviously going to change what they were doing because they were doing so well. And that, so I'll get back to PISA in a second, but when we compare these different models, Pasi Sahlberg wrote the Finnish chapter in the book, talks about the differences, these key differences between what he calls the global education reform movement and that emphasis on competition and school choice, whereas Finland's looking at collaboration among schools, equity of outcomes. There's a difference between standardized learning and personalized learning. And I don't mean personalized learning in the one-to-one computer model. I mean personalized learning in the scaffolding a student to really take their next step in understanding concepts. That's the depth of teaching that we're talking about. And in the global education reform movement model, we have this focus on literacy and numeracy instead of whole child development. And then the notion of a test-based accountability, that people aren't going to move unless they're tested. Whereas Finland is focused on a trust-based responsibility where they scaffold and support teachers to become better teachers, understanding the teacher profession is a long-term profession. And the teachers need help and support, and they will get better, and they will do a good job for their students. So, and I do want to own, as I said before, returning to the PISA scores, that if you look here in 2006, the gap is dramatic. Sweden is in the middle here at 510, and they dropped off all the way to 478 in 2012. And Finland peaked up here in 2006 at 548. But if you follow these out, there is a convergence happening here where the scores are converging. And there's a lot of conversation about what this means. And I looked into it. I don't think anybody really has a great idea. And Martin Carnoy actually, cautioned us when we wrote this book, you don't hang your hat on a cross-sectional analysis such as PISA to really understand long-term policy drivers and even short-term, causal models, because you don't have that level of proof. So it is an indicator that there are a lot of different things going on, not shockingly, but I do want to own that it's, we want to think about, and that's why I said the results are mixed, right? We're not exactly sure how achievement is working. So that's one of the street signs that we have. Achievement is in Latin America was very stark, the difference between Cuba and Chile, but here it's changed and it's gotten a little less so. Despite that, there are still concerns over the investment model in Sweden and for-profit education companies. And the OECD is writing that without ensuring that profits are reinvested to improve education services, that raises concerns over the use of public funding. So we have this issue where we're getting back to, the who benefits part of this entire model. And that's sort of, for me, that's the politics side of things. The funding and the politics that underlies and directs the policy. So I'm going to switch to the United States here. And the US, we have both happening. But if you look at both public investment and privatization happening for a variety of reasons. But in privatization, the models here are primarily based on choice, and they're primarily run through charter schools. And I do want to just emphasize this point of, if you look at the way that funding happens, we have a federalist system. So the taxes on the left side in green are collected by the government. Then we have these two routes where we have inequality in the United States, and that's the blue route of the public route. But in the privatization route, we're adding this middle person. And the taxes that we're collecting to pay for education are also being diverged into private interest. So that reflects back on the OECD finding in Sweden about what are we actually doing here? How are we investing in our education systems? So that's the politics question. And then I had given this example of New Orleans, which is again this model of privatization, choice, and charters. I went through that last time, but today I want to focus more on the outcomes briefly, because that's where we see the type of segregation that happens in this model, in a competition-based model. So we have a top tier of schools that it is a particular type of selective charter schools in New Orleans. And then we have other types of charter schools and alternative schools. And really, so that's sort of how they break out in terms of achievement. But when we look at who has access to these schools, the top tier schools, the top performing schools, almost 90% of the students, the white students in New Orleans, are going to those schools, and only 10% to the other tiers. Whereas if you look at African Americans, it's almost the exact opposite, right? And so you see that there are these sorting mechanisms that are happening. That's why we did the global heat map, to see how this is happening at the global level. Then we go into countries, and then even within jurisdictions, that's where we can find the equity concerns emerging. So just a little bit of an example of what this means at these top tier schools. We teach for pure knowledge. We're not obsessed with tests. At the tier 2 schools, our curriculum is kind of like an emergency management system. The pressure is so extreme, you can have kids take nothing but math and English all day. They're merely focused on acquiring basic skills. In tier 3, you're sitting down the whole time on the computer, not interacting with anybody. It's revisiting basics. Those are fundamentally different ways of thinking about education and student experiences. So one of the things we did was we expanded our research. We then took pairs of cities in Natomas and Oakland in California, Flint and Detroit in the central part of the United States, and Washington, D.C. and Camden in the East Coast. And one of the things we found, that there is intense segregation, and these are schools with 90% or greater students of color in these jurisdictions. what is called intense segregation. So across the board, there's a problem. And this problem, there are problems in other countries too. I mean, a major problem is that we have massive out-of-school populations in the global South, right? So there are these problems of segregation and access. And that's, original reason why competition and choice and privatization are proposed as models for dealing with that. And then when we look, though, we see that in charter schools, we have this double intense segregation of 90% classified as students of color and those qualifying for free and reduced lunch. And so you have these figures in red, which show that there are increased numbers there. So the picture is overall not a great picture. But it's not that privatization is actually improving this level of access. It actually looks to be exacerbating it. And then we see Washington, D.C. they're reporting their free and reduced lunch as an average. So those numbers for D.C. are not actually really super accurate for the differences. And then we look again at particular populations within these groups. And so if you look over here, and this chart, there are a lot of numbers here, but the numbers I'm pointing out these are the test score differences. So charter schools, public schools are doing in Camden 22% worse than their charter school peers. And you're looking at that going, wow, those achievement gaps, that looks like charter schools are doing much better. But then check this out. This is the number, the greater percentage of special education students that these public schools are having in their schools. And this is the kind of data that gets overlooked when people just do performance scores and say we're doing better here, that you don't actually look at what the types of exclusions are in these schools and how the competition-based model actually it incentivizes schools and governments to make decisions about how they allocate students. So in summary, their charter schools are unevenly dispersed nationally. They're primarily in urban areas. Segregation is a major issue for all schools, but and students of color are attending intensely segregated schools. And instead of mitigating segregation, the charter school apparently exacerbated for special education and double segregation. So we're at 7:35. I had planned to talk to you about Canada and talked about Canada as an example of a policy switch because they had a neoliberal system and then they actually changed. They got right to the cusp of vouchers, but then they pulled back from it. But I think in the interest of time, I really want to give Tony the floor here because he's got great findings. And I think I want to also have time for conversation. These slides are going to be available on the website. So I'm going to let you all continue you can see those slides later. There are some resources for further reading. And at this point, I want to turn the floor over to Tony and welcome Tony. And as Amelie said, he studies a relationship between global governance, institutions, and ed policy. And he identifies effects on education quality and equity, specifically on public-private partnership and accountability. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Frank. Also, Amelie and IIEP for the invitation to join this fascinating webinar series on privatization. I will continue by focusing on the effects on equity of different forms of public-private partnerships in education. So I will try to tell you what research on voucher, charter schools, and subsidies, public subsidies for private schools tells us. And actually, again, I think it's impossible to cover all these topics in depth, but if you want to know more, part of what I will tell you this afternoon has been published in this paper in comparative education, in a paper I did together with my colleagues Mauro Moschetti and Clara Fondevila. And also a very important part of these findings are going to be also published in the book that Frank was telling you about. So the idea here is to focus not in all types of privatization policies, but in what is called public-private partnerships, which probably, as you know, as you heard from Frank last week, independent private schools are usually a very small number of, or represent a very small percentage of schools in most educational systems. What is really expanding as growing are these partnerships between the public and the private sector, in which the public is funding private schools or private providers to provide education. Okay, and usually these policies are adopted in the name of giving educational opportunities to disadvantaged populations. So to some extent, the argument behind the adoption of these policies is that they can serve equity purposes. And I will try to show you in this presentation, in the line of what Frank was already saying, that this is not always the case. Actually, usually the case is that this type of policy frameworks tend to expand school segregation and segmentation. So there are three different modalities that are usually the most well-known. Vouchers would represent the most paradigmatic case of how to promote market competition in an educational system through a funding mechanism that follows the demand. So schools need to compete to enroll students. Charter schools has been already presented by Frank as this case of public schools or private providers that are supposed to provide public education, and they are autonomous from some state regulations that apply to conventional public schools. And then we have another modality that is maybe a modality without a strong theory of change behind, that is the public subsidization of private schools. And here usually the rationale is more about cost effectiveness than about promoting school autonomy, market competition, and so on and so forth. So the point is that, as Frank said, the research on the impact of PPPs is not only scarce, but also yields contradictory results. And sometimes we find reviews that they talk about charter schools, vouchers, supply subsidies, but in a very generic way, as very broad categories. And they don't take into account policy design variables when analyzing the equity or the learning achievement effects of these policies. And we think that this is important to open the black box of policy design, because we think that according to how a PPP framework is designed can have better or worse outcomes. So what I will try to cover in my presentation, especially, is the first set of questions. So what are the main effects of different PPP modalities for educational equity, and how are these effects mediated by policy design characteristics? I would like to debate later on, but of course there are different sessions that you will have next week on, what is the role of international organizations and national governments in trying to address these equity problems, and what role for public regulation. But maybe this is something to talk about later on. So when we talk about policy design options, what are we talking about? So we are talking about regulations that are related to what type of providers can be part of a public-private partnership. A key variable here is, can be these providers be profit makers, or only non-for-profit organizations can be part of a PPP program? A student admission policy is another very important regulatory dimension. Are these private schools allowed to select students? Do they have a role in the student admission process? And finally, the funding policy. Are these schools allowed to charge school fees to families on the top of the voucher, on the top of the public subsidy. This is another very important variable. And sometimes there are PPP modalities with a specific variables. We know that voucher programs, they can be universal or targeted. They can be same amount voucher or a scaled voucher. So if a school, then the school has an incentive to enroll most difficult to teach a student, for instance. And then with charter schools, another important variable is whether these schools are operated by an individual operator or by a chain or a charter management organization. So the review that we conducted with Mauro and Clara covered almost 200 impact studies of these different PPP modalities in different dimensions. But as you will see, most of the studies try to look at the impact of these policies on learning achievement and on equity. So when we look at the global impact of these publications, what we observe is that if we put all of them together in a database, is that in general, the majority of studies report negative results. Then there are, of course, a very important number of studies that report positive outcomes, but a big number of studies that also report neutral effects or mixed effects. Mixed effect would be that, for instance, a charter school program in a particular state is doing better in mathematics than public schools, but is doing worse in English. So this would be a mixed, an example of a mixed result. When we unpack a bit more these results according to the PPP modality, to the PPP policy, we find that charter schools and subsidies programs have a very similar distribution of effects, and vouchers, they seem to be doing better. And this has an explanation that I will tell you in a few slides. Okay? But as you can see, the distribution is very similar to what I showed you before. But in the case of voucher programs, there are more positive results and less negative outcomes. And here it's important to unpack the category of what are the outcomes we are talking about. In the review that we conducted, research was focusing on very different types of outcomes. But as I say, the most present type of outcomes are learning outcomes and equity outcomes. And here the picture is very clear, especially when it comes to equity effects of different PPP policies. And I think that it's important to look at this figure as two sides of the same coin, because sometimes there is a trade-off between learning achievement and equity outcomes. This is why well, the learning outcomes category is also important to be unpacked, because sometimes research is looking at the aggregated effects of PPP policies on the educational system, but other times is looking at whether there is a spillover effect of the presence of, let's say, charter schools over public schools. But most of the time, what research is comparing is the learning outcomes between the private provided schools and the public provided schools. So there's a comparison between public and private. And usually the learning outcomes in the private sector are better because these schools have an influence on the social composition of their students. So this is why precisely the equity outcomes of these policies is usually negative, because this type of modalities of provision tend to generate more school segmentation and more school segregation on some dynamics of exclusion of particular students' profiles, as also Frank was saying. So I will just give you the main headline of our findings, because as I said, you can look at specific data, tables, and figures in the publications I mentioned in the beginning. But basically, when it comes to voucher programs, it's very important the variable or the distinction between universal and targeted vouchers, because targeted vouchers, those that go to specific groups of population, ethnic minorities, low-income families, are usually much better than universal vouchers in terms of, especially in terms of equity, because universal vouchers are this idea that was implemented in Chile to promote market competition. And this is the worst modality, let's say, from the point of view of equity, because it generates a lot of segmentation and school segregation. At the same time, if we have to design a voucher program in the name of equity, according to the reviews, to the studies reviewed, it's better that these vouchers programs don't fund for-profit schools, don't allow schools to charge tuition add-ons, and don't allow schools to select students, because when this happens, there is more inequality, there is more school segregation. With charters, we find something very similar. Again, the for-profit charter schools tend to obtain worse effects in terms of equity than non-for-profit charter schools. The variable of the charter management organization is also interesting in the sense that CMOs tend to get better learning outcomes, but they are worse in terms of equity, probably because they are more selective or they have selection strategies that maybe are not so frequent in the context of independent charter schools operators. And then again, when a student selection is allowed, usually what happens is that these programs generate worse equity outcomes. So the main findings of our review clearly show that PPPs are a problematic policy framework in terms of equity. But when we look at the design variables that modulate this finding, what we see is that those PPPs that try to emulate, let's say, market-like dynamics, or that promote more competition between schools or more school choice, or that allow for-profit providers or the schools to define part of the market price of the school service, they generate worse outcomes in terms of a school segregation, a school segmentation, but also exclusion. So this would be one of the main findings of our review. And then I think that it's also interesting to connect this idea of the trade-off between a student achievement and equity, because clearly those PPP programs that do better, or the private schools do better in the context of these PPP programs, is happening when the policy design, the regulations allow for some level of student selection. And this is clearly this idea of trade-off. So if you can influence your composition, then you usually get better learning outcomes, because you can enroll the better achievers or students without special education needs. So the thing is that if we need to give advice to a government on whether they should adopt the PPP or not, maybe our response on the basis of this review could be that you better look for policy alternatives. But what happens when there is already a PPP in place in a country? And here I think that it's important to have a debate on how to regulate this type of PPPs. And a word of caution here is that it's very important to distinguish between formal and informal regulations. Actually, one of the limitations of our review is that it's focusing on formal regulations. But formal regulations, we know that they are not always properly implemented. There are numerous studies that shows that in educational systems where profit is not allowed, student selection is not allowed, charging families school fees is not allowed, these practices still happen. Okay, take the case of student selection. There are a lot of informal mechanisms happening, for instance, in the context of charter school programs, how the schools or the school principal can meet families and encourage or disencourage some families to apply, or to require a strong family involvement in the school, which is something that we know that low-income families or working-class families are disencouraged by this type of practices. Okay, so say this, is a strengthening public regulation, governance, and public accountability the answer to the equity challenges that PPPs generate? And I think that this particular moment in history is very good and very interesting, because we know that many things are going on. Actually, this webinar series is a very good example. We have the Abidjan principles that you will be talking about next week as a very interesting bottom-up approach to the regulation of public-private partnerships. The next Global Education Monitoring Report actually will focus on the role of non-state actors, with a very important focus on governance and regulation. And international organizations like the World Bank, that historically have advocated for PPPs and private solutions in educational systems, are more recently becoming more and more aware about the limitations of this policy approach. So these are some quotations from the 2018 World Development Report that was dedicated to education, where you can see how the World Bank is acknowledging many of the things that both Frank and myself have been telling you about, the limitations of the private sector advantage, the level of segregation that is usually happening in this type of frameworks, etc., etc. So I think that it's really interesting that we are in a context where there is a global consensus that is problematizing the effects of PPPs for equity, which I think is a very first and necessary step to try to find more structural solutions to this problem. So this is all for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Frank, perhaps a few last words to conclude the session before we move to Q&As and other announcements.
I think Tony and I were very much echoing each other's messages, and I even had a last slide that pointed out cream skimming as this selection mechanism that happens, and I can confirm that is often what happens in these types of schools, and it really is a really huge equity concern. I think that Tony's findings are very powerful in the sheer amount of equity concerns that we saw in that one slide. It's kind of a shocking slide, actually.
It's really interesting. Actually, it really gives this kind of a balance or fine analysis between equity and learning and these things that we are all looking for, but that we forget to look inside the mix or the sample of private institutions and providers. So that was really interesting. We have a few very interesting questions on the Q&A box, but before we address them, let me remind all the attendees that the recordings, the PowerPoints, everything will be on the webpage. So I put the link on the webpage on the chat box. And perhaps because we only have a few minutes left before everybody moves to other activities or meetings, let me perhaps select one that I think it gives us enough materials to answer. It comes from Jose Klaus. So research on privatization of education is focused on the management of private schools and or schools agreed with states. So I guess in registration with the states. So 2 questions. How could the underlying segregation in education systems be possible with the privatization of education? Or in other words, is it the state system that drives the privatization of education? And so how to look into this a little bit more. And perhaps if I can add just an extra question from Catalina in Plan. The question is about what type of arguments, perhaps beyond the data that you provided, could we use as to respond to those that insist that the solution to the issue of quality is privately funded schools and within the framework that you described. Perhaps, I don't know, Tony, if you want to start or Frank, but you have to split evenly with very quick answers.
Go ahead, Tony, give it a minute and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, no, I think that all the questions are very good, and maybe we can type some answers later on. But yeah, definitely, there are policy drivers behind privatization, and the example of voucher charter schools I think that are very good to understand how privatization or the private sector has a bigger role in educational system by design. Okay, but in our previous work, what we have also observed is that there are many non-policy drivers of privatization, or the fact that we have a passive state in front of an increasing demand of education is allowing a lot of private operators to emerge. I don't know if you talk about low-fee private schools. This would be another interesting case of a very different nature that is having a big impact in some Latin American countries, sub-Saharan African countries, and in Southeast Asia. So definitely the state is one of the market makers in education, but it's not the only force behind these trends. And maybe here, I think that it's also important to make a comment, because we are talking about education privatization as one of the main drivers of school segregation, but there are other drivers. Probably there's a recent Euridice report basically covering European countries, but is finding results like, okay, maybe 40% of school segregation is explained by private provision, but you also have urban segregation, you also have public schools behaving like private schools in many contexts, that they are also selective, they are also trying to screen a particular profile of students. So I think that one of the problems of privatization is not only having private schools, is the spread of these private or market values in educational systems. So how more and more families, also schools, owners, administrators follow this market rationale independently of the ownership. So unfortunately, in the end, the debate is more complex. And I don't know if, there were other questions, but I am not sure if
I think we are kind of like winding up here. So I'm just going to share my screen here while I answer and remind folks that the next webinar is on March 3rd. And just to kind of reinforce the points, I agree with what Tony just said, but to reinforce that he, where he ended on this demand side. And next time we're going to go into the Abidjan principles as, spelling out the state obligations to really to actually provide high quality free education for all students, and then what that means for parents as well. So I think that's a great place to end it here and to continue on, and we can continue the conversation here about evidence on Twitter. And I just want to say thank everyone for coming, and please join us next Wednesday at the same time.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to the interpreters. Thanks to you, Frank. Thanks to Tony for this great discussion. There were a lot of questions that we couldn't answer, but we will try to work them out during the week before the next session. So let's stop here and connect like next Wednesday for another session altogether on the topic of equity, privatization, and the right to education. Thank you very much, everyone. Mille gracias a todos y todas. Merci à tous. Merci d'avoir été là. Muito obrigada. And até logo. See you next week. À la semaine prochaine.